If they erase your name, do you still exist? The carriage lurched violently as Clara Whitmore's eyes snapped open, darkness pressing in from every side, the air thick with cold and the faint scent of damp leather. Her fingers trembling against the rough wooden bench as she realized the door was locked, sealed from the outside, and somewhere beyond the thin walls, two men spoke in low, careless voices, as though discussing nothing more important than the weather. By sunrise, she'll be gone, one muttered, and the other gave a quiet laugh. The sound dull and distant. No records, no family, no trace, like she was never there at all. And Clara's breath caught in her throat, not from panic, not yet, but from something colder, something deeper, the realization that they were not threatening her life. They were erasing it, unmaking her piece by piece until even memory would refuse to hold her shape. And for a moment, she closed her eyes, pressing her palm against the hidden chain beneath her dress, feeling the small, cold weight of the medallion resting against her skin, the only proof she had ever belonged to anything beyond silence, the only thing they had not taken. The carriage wheels grinding over uneven ground as hours seemed to stretch into something shapeless and endless until at last it stopped. The door wrenched open, and winter rushed in without mercy, biting through fabric and bone alike. Out. One of the men said, not cruelly, not kindly, simply as a fact, and Clara stepped down onto a road she did not recognize, miles from anywhere that mattered. The sky a pale, empty gray above her. The wind carrying no voices, no signs of life. Only the whisper of something vast and indifferent. She did not beg, did not ask why, because the answer was already written in the way they avoided her eyes, in the way the carriage turned and disappeared before she could take more than a single breath, leaving her alone with the sound of her own heartbeat, steady at first, then slower, quieter, as the cold began. Its quiet work. She pulled her coat tighter, though it did little to stop the chill creeping inward. Step by step she moved forward, not toward anything she could see, but simply because standing still felt too much like surrender. The road stretched endlessly, a narrow path swallowed by frost and shadow, her boots slipping against the thin layer of ice as the wind pressed harder, colder, until even the air seemed to resist her lungs. And still she walked, because somewhere deep within her, beneath the exhaustion and the silence, there was something that refused to vanish so easily, something that would not allow her to become nothing. But even that quiet defiance began to fade as her strength gave way, her knees weakening, her vision blurring at the edges, the world softening into white and gray until she reached a narrow stone bridge and could go no farther, her hand brushing the cold surface as she sank slowly, carefully, as though even now she wished to fall with dignity, the medallion slipping free from beneath her collar, catching what little light remained, a faint glimmer against the endless winter. And for a fleeting moment, Clara Whitmore wondered if anyone would ever know she had been here at all, if the world would simply continue, untouched, unchanged, as if she had already faded, as if she had never existed in the first place. The cold did not come all at once, but in quiet layers, like a presence settling beside her, patient and certain, and Clara Whitmore felt it first in her fingers, the sensation fading into something distant and unreal, as though her hands no longer belonged to her, her breath slowing, each inhale shallower than the last while the world around her softened into a blur of pale gray and drifting white. And somewhere in that stillness, a strange calm began to take hold, not peace, never peace, but an absence of struggle that tempted her to close her eyes and let the silence finish what had already begun. Yet her hand remained curled tightly around the medallion, the thin chain biting faintly into her skin as if reminding her that something of her still existed, something not yet surrendered, and she forced her eyes open again, lashes heavy with frost. Her gaze unfocused as she stared across the empty road that stretched endlessly into nothing. No carriage, no footsteps, no sign that she had ever been placed here at all, and a thought flickered weakly through her fading awareness, that this was how it would happen, not with witnesses or words, but with the quiet certainty that by morning, even the memory of Clara Whitmore would dissolve like breath in winter air, and still she did not cry out, did not plead, because there was no one left to hear her voice, only the wind answering itself. only the slow dimming of everything she had once been, until a sound broke through the stillness, faint at first, so distant she thought it imagined. A rhythm carried unevenly across the frozen ground, and for a moment she could not understand it, could not place it within the quiet world she had begun to accept, but it came again, sharper now, deliberate, the unmistakable cadence of hooves striking against the road, and something within her stirred, not hope, not yet, but awareness, fragile and uncertain, her head lifting by instinct rather than strength as she tried to focus on the dark shape emerging through the veil of falling snow, tall, steady, moving with purpose that did not belong to this abandoned place, the horse cutting through the cold with quiet power while its rider remained still, composed, as though the storm itself had no authority over him. And Clara's vision faltered, the edges dimming as the figure drew nearer, until at last the world tilted and she could no longer hold herself upright, her body giving in to the weight it had resisted for too long. Yet before the ground could fully claim her, warmth, sudden and unfamiliar, surrounded her, firm hands lifting her from the frozen stone with a strength that felt impossibly steady. And though she could not fully see him, could not gather more than the outline of dark fabric and the faint glint of something cold and controlled in his presence, she felt it clearly, the shift in the air, the interruption of the silence that had nearly taken her, and through the haze, a voice reached her, low and measured, not raised, not hurried, but absolute in a way that allowed no argument. You are not meant to die here. And for the first time since the carriage door had opened, Clara Whitmore's breath faltered not from the cold, but from the quiet, undeniable certainty that someone had found her before the world could forget she existed at all. The world did not return all at once, but in fragments, in the slow awareness of warmth that did not belong to memory and movement that did not belong to dreams. And Clara Whitmore felt it first in the steady rhythm beneath her, the rise and fall that told her she was no longer lying on frozen stone, but carried, lifted beyond the place where she had been meant to disappear, her lashes trembling as she tried to open her eyes, the effort heavy, as though even light had become something distant. Yet shapes began to form, dark fabric close to her cheek, the faint scent of cold air and something sharper, cleaner, and she realized with quiet disbelief that she was held against someone, not loosely, not carelessly, but with a firmness that allowed no slipping, no falling back into the emptiness she had nearly surrendered to, the horse beneath them moving with controlled strength as the wind pressed around them, no longer biting in the same merciless way, shielded now by the presence that had interrupted her fading, and though she did not understand how or why, she felt it clearly, the difference between being abandoned and being kept, and somewhere through the haze, the voice came again, closer this time, steady as before. "Stay awake," he said, not commanding, not pleading, but certain in a way that reached through the fog in her mind, and Clara tried, drawing in a shallow breath that burned slightly in her chest as life returned in small, fragile increments, her fingers tightening weakly against the fabric at his coat as if to confirm he was real, not some final illusion before everything ended. The journey stretching on through a landscape she could not fully see, the outlines of trees and distant stone blurring together as the storm began to ease. And eventually, the rhythm slowed, the horse coming to a controlled halt as something vast rose before them, a structure emerging through the thinning snow, tall and unyielding, its dark stone walls catching what little light remained in the fading afternoon, and even in her weakened state. Clara felt it, the weight of the place, not unwelcoming, not cruel, but distant, as though it belonged to a world far removed from the one she had known. The gates opening without question as they approached, the quiet efficiency of unseen hands confirming that the man who carried her did not need to explain himself to anyone. And as they passed beneath the archway, the cold seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by a stillness that held its own kind of gravity, the horse stopping once more before wide steps leading into the hall, and strong hands shifted slightly, adjusting her weight as he dismounted with practiced ease, never once loosening his hold on her. The doors opening before he reached them, revealing a dim interior lit by the unsteady glow of firelight, shadows stretching long across polished floors and high stone walls, voices low and controlled, careful not to rise, as though even sound was measured within these walls. And Clara felt herself carried across the threshold, the outside world closing behind her with a finality she could not yet comprehend, the cold replaced by a distant warmth that reached her slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether she would accept it. And though her strength was nearly gone, her awareness flickered just enough to catch one final detail before darkness claimed her again, the brief movement of his hand as it brushed aside the edge of her collar, revealing the medallion she had guarded so fiercely, and the subtle, unmistakable stillness that followed, a pause that did not belong to chance, as though something within that small piece of silver had just changed the course of everything she thought she understood. Warmth returned in slow, cautious waves, not as comfort, but as something unfamiliar, something Clara Whitmore did not yet trust, her body still caught between the memory of cold and the quiet presence that now surrounded her. The faint crackle of fire reaching her first, soft and steady, followed by the distant murmur of voices kept deliberately low, as though the walls themselves demanded restraint. And when her eyes finally opened, the world appeared in fragments of amber light and shadowed stone, a high ceiling disappearing into darkness above her, heavy drapery drawn close against tall windows, and the subtle scent of polished wood and burning cedar lingering in the air. She lay beneath layers of thick blankets, their weight grounding her in a reality she had not expected to return to, her fingers shifting slightly as sensation crept back into them, slow and tingling. And for a brief moment she remained still, uncertain whether movement would shatter whatever fragile safety had been placed around her. But then memory returned, not all at once, but enough. The carriage, the voices, the road, the silence that had nearly claimed her, and the man who had stepped into that silence as though it had no power over him, her breath catching faintly as she turned her head, the room coming into sharper focus until she saw him, standing near the fire with a stillness that seemed deliberate rather than idle, his posture composed, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair as though he had been waiting, not impatiently, not anxiously, but with the quiet certainty of someone who expected the world to follow its course without question, his gaze lifting to meet hers the moment she moved, not startled, not softened, simply aware, and for reasons she could not fully name. Clara felt that same strange shift again, the one she had sensed when he first found her. The feeling of being seen in a way that did not demand explanation. "You are awake," he said, his voice as measured as before, carrying no unnecessary warmth yet lacking any trace of indifference. And Clara swallowed, her throat dry, her voice uncertain when it came. "I am not dead." The words sounded almost foreign, as though she had not expected to speak them again, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite approval, but an acknowledgement of the truth she had reached. "No," he replied simply. "You are not." Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but weighted, as if both of them understood that what had happened before this room could not be undone by warmth alone. Clara's hand instinctively moved toward her collar, searching for the medallion, and she stilled when she felt it still there, still hidden, still hers. Yet his gaze shifted briefly, almost imperceptibly, and she knew then that he had seen it, not by accident, not in passing, but with intent. The awareness settled between them like something unspoken yet undeniable. "This house does not receive strangers without reason," he continued after a moment, his tone unchanged. "And yet you were left where no one was meant to find you." Clara lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in thought, choosing her words with care. "That was the intention," she said quietly, and the simplicity of it seemed to hold more weight than explanation ever could. The fire crackled softly, shadows shifting across the walls as he regarded her in silence once more, and though he did not move closer, did not press further, there was something in the stillness of his presence that made it clear he was not a man who accepted half-truths lightly. And yet he did not demand more, not yet. Instead, he stepped back slightly, the distance measured, controlled. "You will remain here until you are well enough to stand on your own," he said, not as an offer, but as a fact. And Clara felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not quite relief, but the unfamiliar weight of being kept in a world that had already decided to erase her. And as the firelight flickered between them, she understood one thing with quiet certainty. The silence that had nearly taken her no longer held the same power within these walls, because someone had chosen, deliberately, that she would not disappear. Morning did not arrive with sunlight, but with a gradual lifting of shadows, the dim gray of winter pressing faintly against the tall windows while the fire had burned low to embers, and Clara Whitmore lay still beneath the heavy blankets, her eyes open long before she allowed herself to move, listening, measuring the quiet of this place that did not yet belong to her. The silence here was different from the one that had nearly taken her. It was not empty, not waiting to erase, but held, contained, as though every sound had purpose and every absence of sound was chosen rather than abandoned. She shifted, slightly, the motion slow but deliberate, testing the strength that had begun to return to her limbs, the ache still present but no longer overwhelming. And with careful effort, she pushed herself upright, the room tilting only slightly before settling again, her breath steadying as she adjusted to the simple act of sitting, the blankets falling around her shoulders like something protective rather than confining. And for a moment she remained there, gathering herself, before her gaze moved across the room, taking in details she had not seen clearly before, the carved edges of the furniture, the thick curtains drawn against the cold, the faint reflection of light against polished surfaces, everything precise, everything controlled, nothing left to chance. And she understood then that this was not merely a place of shelter, but a place governed by someone who allowed nothing within its walls without intention. The door opened quietly, not abruptly, but with a measured movement that did not startle, yet did not ask permission either. And a woman entered, her posture composed, her expression neutral but not unkind, carrying a tray with simple necessities, water, bread, and something warm that carried a faint, comforting scent. "You are awake," the woman said softly, placing the tray on a small table nearby, her tone respectful yet observant. As though she had been instructed to notice everything without intruding, Clara inclined her head slightly, her voice still quiet but steadier now. "I am," she replied, and the woman studied her for a brief moment before offering a small nod. "His Grace does not often bring guests into this house," she said, not as a question, but as a statement that carried its own weight. Clara's fingers tightened faintly around the edge of the blanket, the words settling in her mind, not as comfort, but as confirmation that her presence here was not ordinary, not expected, and perhaps not entirely understood even by those who served within. "These walls, I did not come by choice," Clara answered after a moment, her gaze steady despite the uncertainty beneath it, and the woman's expression shifted only slightly, a flicker of something that might have been acknowledgement. "Few who arrive here do," she said simply, before turning to leave, her steps as quiet as her entrance, leaving Clara once again alone with the silence. But it did not feel the same as before, not as suffocating, not as final. Her attention moved back to the medallion beneath her collar, her hand lifting to rest lightly over it, feeling its familiar shape, its quiet promise that she had not imagined her past, that something of her still remained beyond what had been taken. And yet now there was something else layered beneath that thought, something she could not yet name. The awareness that the man who had brought her here had seen it, had recognized something in it that had altered the way he looked at her, and that realization carried its own weight, because it meant her story, the one that had been nearly erased, was not entirely hidden anymore. And as she sat in the dim light of the room, listening to the distant sounds of a house that functioned with quiet precision, Clara Whitmore understood that survival had not ended on that frozen road. It had only changed its form, because here, within walls that did not forget, being seen might prove just as dangerous as being erased. The day unfolded slowly within Blackwood Hall, not marked by time, but by the quiet rhythm of a house that seemed to breathe in measured restraint. And Clara Whitmore found herself listening more than moving, her senses sharpening as her strength returned in careful increments. Each step she took across the room deliberate, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of a chair for balance. The cold that had once consumed her now replaced by a lingering chill that refused to fully leave. As Though her body remembered what it had endured even when her mind tried to place distance between herself and that frozen road, she paused near the window, the heavy curtain drawn back just enough to reveal the landscape beyond, a stretch of winter fields untouched and silent, the world outside appearing distant, almost unreal, as if it belonged to another life she had narrowly escaped, and yet the sight of it stirred something uneasy within her, a reminder that the place meant to erase her still existed somewhere beyond those walls. Waiting perhaps for confirmation that its work had been completed, her fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of the curtain before she let it fall back into place, sealing the outside away once more. The soft sound of footsteps approached, steady and unhurried, and she turned just as the door opened again, this time without hesitation, and he entered, Duke Nathaniel Blackwood, moving with the same composed presence she had come to recognize, his gaze sweeping the room briefly before settling on her, not surprised to find her standing, but assessing in a way that suggested he had expected her to reach this point sooner or later. "You should not be on your feet for long," he said, his tone even, not reprimanding, but factual, and Clara straightened slightly despite the lingering weakness, her posture instinctively guarded. "I am not as fragile as I appear," she replied quietly, and for a moment, the faintest shift crossed his expression, something that might have been acknowledgement rather than contradiction. He stepped further into the room, the distance between them measured, controlled, as though he allowed space not out of hesitation, but out of respect for boundaries neither of them had yet defined. "Fragility is not always visible," he said after a moment, his voice low, carrying a weight that suggested the statement belonged to more than the present moment, and Clara felt the words settle between them, not as a challenge, but as something understood without the need for explanation. Silence followed again, but it was no longer empty. It held questions neither of them had yet spoken. Her hand moved unconsciously toward the medallion once more, and this time he did not look away, his gaze fixed on the small motion with quiet intensity. "Where did you get it?" he asked, the question direct, without preamble, and Clara stilled, her breath catching faintly as she met his eyes, knowing that whatever answer she gave would not remain without consequence. "It belonged to my mother," she said carefully, the truth simple but incomplete, and his expression did not change, yet something in the stillness of his posture sharpened, as though the answer confirmed a suspicion he had not yet voiced. "That crest does not belong to those without history," he replied, his tone unchanged but carrying an edge of certainty, and Clara felt the weight of the medallion more heavily than before, as though it had shifted from being a hidden piece of her past to something that could alter her present. "I was told it meant nothing," she said quietly, and for the first time, his gaze shifted, not away from her, but inward, as if measuring the distance between what he had been told and what he knew to be true. "You were told incorrectly," he said at last, the words calm but absolute, and the room seemed to settle into a deeper silence as that truth took hold, because it meant that whatever had been taken from her, whatever had been erased, had not been without reason, and as Clara stood there beneath the dim light of the room, facing a man who did not accept coincidence, she understood that the past she had been forced to leave behind had not ended on that road. It had followed her here, into a house that did not ignore what others chose to forget. Silence did not break after his words but deepened, settling between them like something inevitable, and Clara Whitmore felt it in the way the room seemed to hold its breath, as though even the walls understood that what had just been spoken could not be undone, her fingers tightening slightly around the medallion as if it had grown heavier. No longer just a memory, but a question that demanded an answer she had never been allowed to know, and she lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not in surrender but in thought, searching for something solid within a past that had always felt just out of reach. "My mother never spoke of it," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty beneath it. "Only that I was to keep it hidden." The admission hung in the air, simple yet layered with meaning, and Nathaniel Blackwood did not interrupt, did not dismiss. His attention fixed on her with that same unwavering focus that seemed to strip away anything unnecessary, leaving only what mattered. "Hidden things are rarely without consequence," he replied after a moment, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that suggested experience rather than speculation, and Clara felt a faint shift within herself. Not fear, but recognition, because she had lived within those hidden edges for as long as she could remember, always aware that something about her existence did not belong in the life she had been given, always careful not to question too deeply, as if knowing too much would place her exactly where she had been left, alone and meant to vanish. She lifted her eyes again, meeting his gaze directly this time, and there was no pleading there, no attempt to soften the truth, only quiet resolve. Someone believed it was enough to erase me for, she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than accusation ever could. Nathaniel's expression did not change, yet something in his stillness sharpened. The controlled composure of a man who did not react impulsively, but who understood the implications beneath the surface. Then they believed you were worth removing, he said, and Clara felt the words settle within her in a way she had not expected, not as validation, but as confirmation that her existence had never been insignificant, even if it had been treated as such. The firelight flickered between them, casting shifting shadows that moved across the walls like silent witnesses to a conversation neither of them had intended to have, and yet neither stepped away from it. You said this house does not receive strangers without reason, Clara continued after a moment, her voice quiet but steady. So why am I here? The question was not defiant, not accusing, but direct, because she understood now that nothing within these walls happened without purpose, and Nathaniel regarded her for a long moment before answering, his gaze unwavering, as though measuring not the question but the one who asked it. Because I do not ignore what others try to erase, he said at last, the words spoken without emphasis, yet carrying a certainty that left no space for doubt, and something in Clara's chest tightened again, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of being chosen to remain. The silence that followed felt different now, not uncertain, but shifting, as though the boundaries between them had altered in a way neither could fully define. And yet there was something else beneath it, something unresolved, something waiting beyond the walls of this room. And as if the thought itself had called it into being, a distant sound echoed faintly through the hall beyond, not loud, not abrupt, but deliberate. The unmistakable presence of movement where none had been before, and Nathaniel's attention shifted instantly, not startled, but aware, his posture changing in the slightest way that spoke of readiness rather than concern, his gaze returning to Clara for a brief moment, steady and unreadable, before he spoke again, his voice low but firm. It seems the world has not forgotten you as completely as it intended, and for the first time since she had stepped into this place, Clara understood that being found might not be the end of what had begun on that frozen road, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. The sound did not echo loudly, yet it carried through the halls with a precision that did not belong to chance. Measured footsteps, more than one, steady and deliberate, and Clara Whitmore felt the shift in the air before anything else changed. A subtle tightening within the room, as though the very walls had drawn closer, holding something at bay, her breath slowing as she instinctively stilled, her hand remaining lightly against the medallion beneath her collar, not out of fear alone, but out of understanding, because whatever had begun on that frozen road had not ended when she crossed the threshold of this house. It had followed her, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment it would be acknowledged again. Nathaniel Blackwood did not move immediately, yet his presence altered, not in urgency, but in focus, his attention no longer resting solely on her, but extending beyond the door, toward whatever approached with such quiet certainty. And when he finally stepped forward, it was with the calm authority of a man who did not react to uncertainty but defined it. The door opened before he reached it, not abruptly, but with a controlled motion, revealing the dim corridor beyond where a figure stood waiting, composed and formal, his posture rigid in the way of someone accustomed to delivering messages that were not his own. "Your Grace," the man said, his voice low, respectful, yet carrying an undercurrent that suggested the words he bore were not ordinary. Nathaniel's gaze remained steady, unreadable. "Speak," he replied, and the man inclined his head slightly before continuing. "There are visitors at the gate." The statement was simple, but it did not end there. The brief pause that followed spoke more than the words themselves, and Clara felt it immediately, the weight of what had not yet been said settling into the space between them. They claimed to be searching for someone, the man added carefully, and though no name was spoken, no description given, the silence that followed carried a clarity that required no further explanation. Clara's fingers tightened faintly, not visibly, but enough for her to feel the shift within herself, the quiet realization that she had not been lost, not entirely. Someone had noticed her absence, not with concern, but with purpose, and that purpose had now reached the very place she had believed to be beyond its reach. Nathaniel did not turn to her immediately, his gaze remaining fixed on the man before him. Yet there was a subtle stillness in his posture, a pause that suggested calculation rather than hesitation. "And what do they say this person has done?" he asked, his tone unchanged, as though the question held no particular significance. But the man's answer came with a careful precision that revealed otherwise. "They say she is not meant to be found." The words settled heavily into the room, quiet yet absolute, and for a brief moment, Clara felt the echo of that frozen road again. The same intention, the same quiet certainty that her existence had been marked for absence rather than presence. Nathaniel's expression did not shift, but something in his gaze darkened, not with anger, but with a depth of understanding that ran beneath the surface. "Then they have come to the wrong place," he said simply, the words carrying no raised tone, no visible defiance, yet leaving no space for interpretation. The man inclined his head once more, acknowledging the answer without question, before stepping back, the door closing with the same controlled finality with which it had opened, and the silence returned. But it was no longer the same. It was charged now, defined by the knowledge that what waited beyond those walls would not simply disappear. Clara exhaled slowly, her breath steady despite the tightening in her chest. And when Nathaniel finally turned to face her again, there was no distance in his gaze now, no uncertainty, only the quiet, unyielding resolve of someone who had already made his decision. "You were meant to vanish," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of what had been set in motion long before she had been placed on that road. And Clara met his gaze without looking away, her voice equally quiet, yet unwavering. "And yet I did not," she replied. And something passed between them in that moment, not spoken, not defined, but understood, because outside those walls, the world had come to claim what it believed no longer existed, and inside them, one man had already decided that it would leave empty-handed. The quiet did not remain untouched for long, because once something was claimed, the world had a way of pressing back against that claim, and Clara Whitmore felt it not in sound, but in the subtle shift of everything around her. The house no longer simply shelter, but a boundary, a line drawn between what was meant to be lost and what had been deliberately kept. She remained where she stood, her posture steady despite the unease that had begun to settle beneath her ribs, not fear in its rawest form, but awareness, the kind that sharpened every breath and made silence feel like a held note waiting to break. Nathaniel Blackwood did not move immediately after the door closed, yet his stillness was no longer passive. It carried weight now, intention, as though every choice from this moment forward would carry consequence beyond the walls of this room. He stepped past her without haste, his presence brushing the space between them not as intrusion, but as inevitability, and Clara turned slightly, her gaze following him as he crossed toward the far side of the chamber, where a tall window stood veiled by heavy drapery. He pulled the curtain aside with a measured motion, revealing the dim outline of the grounds beyond, the gates just visible in the distance through the pale winter light. And though she could not see the figures waiting there, she felt them, the unseen pressure of expectation, of intent, of something that had traveled far enough to demand an answer. "They will not leave easily," she said quietly, her voice steady, not questioning but acknowledging what both of them already understood. Nathaniel did not turn at once, his gaze fixed outward as though measuring not the distance, but the resolve of those who waited beyond it. "No," he replied after a moment, his tone calm. "They will not." And there was no frustration in the words, no irritation, only acceptance, as if resistance itself was something he had anticipated long before this moment arrived. Clara drew a slow breath, her hand lowering from the medallion at her collar, not because it no longer mattered, but because she understood now that hiding it would not undo what had already been set in motion. If they came this far, she continued, her eyes steady on his back, then they will not leave without proof. The statement lingered in the air, quiet but undeniable, and Nathaniel's gaze shifted slightly, not away from the window, but inward, as though considering the shape of that proof and what it might require. They will receive none, he said at last, and though the words were simple, there was something in them that settled with finality, not as defiance, but as fact. Clara felt the weight of that certainty press against her thoughts, because it meant that whatever had begun as an attempt to erase her had now become something else entirely, something that would not resolve quietly. Her gaze moved toward the door, the same door that separated them from the rest of the house, from the people who served within it, and from the ones who had come to take her back into absence. You are placing your house between them and what they want, she said softly, not as accusation, but as recognition, and this time, Nathaniel turned, his eyes meeting hers directly, the distance between them unchanged, yet the understanding within it deeper than before. I am placing myself there, he corrected, his voice low, unwavering, and Clara felt something shift within her at that, not relief, not entirely, but the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of being defended by choice rather than necessity. The silence returned once more, but it did not carry uncertainty now, it carried direction, and as the faint sound of movement echoed again from somewhere beyond the room, Clara Whitmore understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by those waiting at the gates, but by the man who had already refused to let her vanish once, and who now stood between her and a world that had come to claim what it believed had already been lost. The decision did not remain contained within the quiet of the room for long, because Blackwood Hall was not a place where actions lingered in thought without becoming reality, and Clara Whitmore felt the shift before she saw it, the subtle change in movement beyond the walls, the quiet efficiency of a household that had already begun to respond to something unspoken yet clearly understood. Nathaniel Blackwood moved toward the door without haste, his steps measured, his expression unchanged, yet there was a finality in the way he reached for the handle, as though whatever lay beyond it had already been resolved in his mind. Clara remained where she stood for a moment, watching him, the weight of his earlier words settling deeper within her, not as reassurance, but as a truth she could not ignore. And when he opened the door, the corridor beyond revealed itself in dim light and quiet order. Servants moving with restrained purpose, their voices low, their eyes careful, as though their presence at the gates had already altered the balance of the house. Stay here, he said without turning, his voice calm, not commanding but absolute. And Clara did not argue, not because she felt compelled to obey, but because she understood that this was not a moment for uncertainty. This was a moment that would define what came next. She inclined her head slightly, a silent acknowledgement, and watched as he stepped into the hall, the door closing behind him with a soft but decisive sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The room grew still once more, but it was no longer the same stillness. It carried tension now, the kind that settled beneath the surface and waited. Clara moved slowly toward the window again, her steps steadier than before, her body no longer as fragile as it had been when she first arrived, yet her thoughts were sharper now, more aware, her gaze lifting toward the distant gates barely visible through the winter haze. And though she could not make out the figures waiting there, she felt their presence, insistent, deliberate, unwilling to leave without answer. Her hand rose instinctively to the medallion once more, her fingers tracing its edge as if searching for something it had never revealed before, something that might explain why her existence had become something worth pursuing, something worth reclaiming or removing entirely. The minutes stretched, not long, but heavy, each second marked by the quiet awareness that what was happening beyond the walls would not remain distant for long. And then, faintly, the sound reached her, voices carried from deeper within the hall, not raised, not hostile, but firm, controlled, the unmistakable cadence of confrontation without chaos. And Clara's breath slowed as she listened, not to the words, which remained indistinct, but to the tone, to the balance of power contained within them, because even without hearing clearly, she could sense it, the refusal, the boundary being drawn, the quiet, unwavering denial that did not require force to hold its ground. She stepped closer to the door, not touching it, but near enough that the sound became slightly clearer, fragments of speech forming and dissolving before they could fully reach her, until one voice, unfamiliar and sharp in its precision, carried enough weight to be understood. "You are interfering in matters that do not concern you." And though the words were directed elsewhere, Clara felt them settle within her, because she understood what they implied, that she was something to be handled, something to be removed without question. And then Nathaniel's voice answered, calm, unyielding, the same steady tone that had found her on that frozen road. "Everything within these walls concerns me." The reply was simple, but it carried a finality that left no room for argument. The silence that followed seemed to stretch, as though even those who had come prepared had not expected such an answer, and Clara remained where she was, her hand resting lightly against the wood of the door, her breath steady, despite the quiet storm unfolding just beyond it, because she understood now, with a clarity that left no space for doubt, that whatever had been decided in her absence was no longer beyond her reach. It was unfolding here, now, and for the first time since she had been placed on that road, her fate was no longer being determined by those who wished her gone, but by the one man who had chosen, without hesitation, that she would remain. The silence after his words did not feel like victory, but like a line drawn so clearly that even those who opposed it were forced to recognize its weight. And Clara Whitmore remained by the door, her hand resting lightly against the wood, as if the barrier between her and the hall had become something more than distance, something that separated two versions of her life, the one where she had been led away without question, and the one where someone had chosen to stand between her and that fate. The voices beyond the door resumed, quieter now, measured, as though the tone had shifted from demand to negotiation. Yet beneath it all, Clara could still sense the same intent, unchanged, unyielding, the desire to reclaim what had been marked for disappearance. And she understood then that this was not simply about her presence in this house. It was about what she represented, something unresolved, something unfinished. Her fingers moved once more to the medallion, the cool metal grounding. As she tried to piece together fragments that had never fully formed, her mother's quiet warnings, the way certain questions had always been deflected, the feeling that her existence had been something to manage rather than to celebrate. And now those fragments pressed closer, demanding meaning, because someone had come too far, with too much certainty, for this to be anything less than deliberate. The voices outside grew clearer again, not because they had risen, but because she had stepped closer, her breath steady as she listened. "You cannot deny what is owed," the unfamiliar voice said, controlled but insistent, and Clara felt the words settle into her thoughts, not as accusation, but as something larger, something that extended beyond her. Understanding, and Nathaniel's reply followed, calm as before, yet carrying a deeper weight. "I deny nothing that has been proven," he said, and there was something in the phrasing that shifted the balance, not rejecting the claim outright, but refusing to accept it without truth. A pause followed, longer this time, as though the one who had spoken weighed his next words carefully. "Then perhaps you should consider what you are protecting." The voice continued, quieter now, but edged with meaning, and Clara felt the impact of it more sharply than anything before, because it suggested that whatever she was, whatever she carried unknowingly, was not something neutral, not something easily dismissed. Her breath slowed, her posture straightening despite the tension that settled beneath her ribs, and when Nathaniel answered, there was no hesitation, no reconsideration, only the same unyielding certainty that had defined every word he had spoken since she arrived. "I already have," he said, and the simplicity of the response left no space for further argument. The silence that followed was not empty, but resolved, as though something had reached its limit and found no ground to move forward. Footsteps echoed again, retreating this time, not hurried, not defeated, but withdrawn, carrying with them the understanding that the answer they sought would not be given here, at least not today. Clara exhaled slowly, the breath leaving her as though she had been holding it since the moment she heard the first sound at the gate, her hand lowering from the door as the quiet returned fully. Yet it was not the same quiet as before. It was marked now, altered by what had passed through it, and when The handle finally turned, and the door opened once more. Nathaniel stepped inside with the same composed presence, his expression unchanged, yet something in his gaze held a deeper focus, as though the encounter had confirmed more than it had revealed. Clara met his eyes without hesitation, her voice steady despite the questions that now pressed against her thoughts. "They know who I am," she said, not as a question, but as a realization that had taken shape beyond doubt, and Nathaniel regarded her for a long moment before answering, his tone as calm as ever, yet carrying a quiet certainty that settled heavily into the space between them. "They know what you might be," he corrected, and Clara felt the distinction settle into her understanding, not as clarity, but as something more complex, something that had not yet fully revealed itself. And as the firelight flickered once more across the room, she understood that what had begun as an attempt to erase her had now become something far more dangerous, because being found was no longer the question, it was what would be done with her now that she had been. The distinction did not fade after he spoke it. It settled deeper, taking root in the quiet space between them, and Clara Whitmore felt the weight of it in a way that could not be dismissed. "Not who you are, but what you might be." The words lingered as something unfinished, something that suggested her past was not simply hidden but altered, shaped by forces she had never been allowed to understand. Her fingers tightened slightly around the medallion, as if it might offer an answer now that it had revealed its importance, but it remained the same cold, silent object it had always been, offering no clarity, only presence. "Then tell me," she said at last, her voice steady despite the uncertainty beneath it. "What do they believe I am?" The question did not carry fear, but it did carry urgency, because she understood now that ignorance was no longer a shield. Nathaniel Blackwood did not answer immediately, his gaze resting on her with the same measured focus, as though he weighed not the question but the moment in which it had been asked. The firelight shifted across his features, casting brief shadows that deepened the stillness of his expression. "They believe you are connected to something that was never meant to disappear," he said finally, his tone calm, but the words carried an undercurrent that suggested far more than they revealed. Clara's breath slowed as she absorbed this, the pieces within her mind shifting, aligning in ways that felt both unfamiliar and inevitable. Her mother's silence, the hidden medallion, the deliberate act of erasure. None of it had been random. None of it had been without reason. "And you?" she continued, her gaze steady on his. "What do you believe?" The question hung between them, quieter than the last, but no less significant, because she understood now that his choice to protect her was not based on uncertainty. It was based on something he had already begun to see. Nathaniel stepped closer then, not abruptly, not intrusively, but with a deliberate motion that shortened the distance between them just enough to shift the balance of the moment. His eyes did not leave hers, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that did not require emphasis. "I believe someone went to great lengths to ensure you would never ask that question," he said, and Clara felt something tighten within her chest, not from fear, but from recognition, because it meant her past had not been erased by accident. It had been controlled, shaped to prevent exactly this moment, this awareness. She exhaled slowly, her posture straightening despite the weight of what she now understood. "Then they failed," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a quiet strength that had not been present before. Nathaniel's gaze did not shift, yet there was a subtle change in the stillness around him, as though her answer had confirmed something he had already begun to expect. The firelight flickered once more, casting their shadows against the walls behind them, no longer separate, but overlapping in a way that suggested something new, something not yet defined but already taking shape. "They will return," Clara said after a moment, her voice calm, not questioning, but acknowledging the inevitability of it. And Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, but in confirmation. "Yes," he replied, but not in the same way. The words carried meaning beyond their simplicity, and Clara understood it. The first attempt had been quiet, controlled, designed to erase without notice. The next would not be, because now there was resistance. Now there was a presence that would not allow her to vanish without consequence. Her hand lowered from the medallion, not because it no longer mattered, but because she understood now that its significance extended beyond her alone. It was a connection, a thread that tied her to something larger, something that had been hidden but not destroyed. And as she stood there within the dim light of Blackwood Hall, facing a man who had chosen to stand against what others had already decided, Clara Whitmore realized that survival had never been the end of her story. It had only been the beginning of a truth that was finally, and inevitably, coming into the light. The truth did not arrive as a revelation, but as a quiet alignment of everything that had once felt incomplete, and Clara Whitmore stood in the dim glow of the firelight with a stillness that no longer came from uncertainty, but from understanding, the kind that did not demand immediate answers, but refused to be ignored any longer. The medallion at her throat no longer felt like something to hide, but something to carry with purpose, a silent acknowledgement of a past that had been shaped in shadows yet had survived every attempt to erase it. And across from her, Nathaniel Blackwood remained unmoving, his presence steady, not as a force that overshadowed her, but as one that stood beside the truth now unfolding. "Then it was never about removing me," Clara said quietly, her voice clear despite the weight of what it held. "It was about keeping something hidden," and Nathaniel inclined his head slightly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition of the conclusion she had reached on her own. "And now that it has been found," he replied, his tone calm, "they will not allow it to remain unclaimed." The words settled into the room with quiet certainty, not as a threat, but as a reality neither of them would deny. Clara's gaze shifted briefly toward the window, toward the distant gates that had already borne witness to the first attempt to reclaim her absence, and she understood now that there would be no returning to the life she had known before, no slipping back into obscurity, because that life had never truly been hers to begin with. "Then I will not return to being unseen," she said. And there was no hesitation in the statement, no trace of doubt, only the quiet resolve of someone who had already faced what it meant to be erased and had chosen, deliberately, to exist anyway. Nathaniel's gaze held hers, and for the first time, there was something within it that shifted beyond observation, something that acknowledged not only her presence, but her choice. "No," he said simply, "you will not." The silence that followed was not empty, but complete, as though something had settled into place that could not be undone, and yet beyond that stillness, the world continued, waiting, watching, preparing for what would come next. Clara drew a slow breath, her hand lowering from the medallion, not because it no longer mattered, but because she understood now that its significance extended beyond protection. It was a key, one she had carried unknowingly, one that others had sought to hide, and now one that would inevitably draw them back again. "When they return," she said, her voice steady, not questioning, but acknowledging the inevitability of it, and Nathaniel did not look away, did not offer reassurance that did not belong to the truth. "They will find that you are no longer alone," he answered, and the words were not spoken as comfort, but as a fact that would stand whether challenged or not. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, and in that moment, there was no trace of the girl who had been left to vanish on a forgotten road, only the quiet strength of someone who had been found, not by chance, but by choice, and who had chosen in return to remain. And as the firelight flickered once more against the stone walls of Blackwood Hall, casting long shadows that no longer seemed empty but alive with meaning, Clara Whitmore understood that whatever had begun in silence would not end the same way, because some lives are not meant to disappear, and some truths refuse to stay buried, no matter how carefully the world tries to forget them.